rods on and increase it up to 30 to 1. So now you know that you're not getting anything from the back if you're listening. It's got to be coming from the direction where you got the thing aimed. And you can run it on up to 100 to 1 in the ratio because of the way the pattern is going to be. So these are very common type antennas, particularly for TV reception before we all had cable. Okay? People had Yagi antennas like this on top of their houses aimed at the transmitter, the TV transmitter. Here's an example of just a 3-element Yagi, which in many cases is good enough. And it has a little rotator up here, so if the guy that's using this antenna wants to move it from looking over here to looking over here, or listening to somebody somewhere else in the world and the signal is coming in from here, he can rotate the antenna around. That's very common. Here's a little higher set design. It's going to have a little more directivity, as I showed in the patterns previously. This is a circularly polarized Yagi. It's also called a helical antenna. You can see it's basically the same thing with the helix. And then we have, this one's a little more interesting, and you'll probably notice this. I'm supposed to stand over here, sorry. I've still seen this on houses today that probably don't have cable. This really has 3 different antennas right up there all together. And the frequencies in the 3 different antennas are far enough apart so they're really not interfering with one another. If you can see way down on the bottom right-hand side, that's actually a bunch of little teeny elements for a Yagi antenna, okay? And then right in there is another Yagi antenna of a little higher frequency that's above the whole set. And then we have one other type. This is a different type of antenna. This is called the log periodic. And the log periodic is a totally different design from a Yagi. It has a bunch of different length elements in it, and all of these are connected in parallel, so that gives you a very broad frequency band of operation. The Yagi itself has only got one resonant element in it. That's the feed element, and it's a very narrow band. But a log periodic is a very broadband antenna.
Bob, question.
Question.
In these cases like this, are we talking about the constructive and destructive interference between subsequent antennas, such that
No.
the radiation is?
No, putting these 3 antennas all up on the same pole, they were all pretty much acting independently. Because the frequencies are so different. Look at the difference in the size between the blue antenna, the red antenna, and the green antenna. And remember, these are resonant length arms. So they're really, it's like 3 different tones.
And they don't cross talk to each other, no?
No, these aren't going to interfere with one another.
No.
They may in a very slight way, but not as a big deal. Like I said, I still see houses with multiple antennas on top of them that people never took down, even though they may have cable now.
I have a question.
Question?
Well, the 2 pictures on the right, they have, it looks like extra stuff, extra.
Okay, I'll address
Okay.
that. On the, let's go back to the single Yagi here. The middle element is the active element. It's like a dipole. The element in front of it is called a director, and that's the shorter of the 2 that I added. And the one behind it is called a reflector, and that's the longer of the 2 that were added. So when I have just the 3 elements, it tends to move the beam in one direction, okay? You add more directors, which is more directors, and they also added more reflectors in the back. So this has really been a lot of effort put into that to improve the pattern. But it still does the same thing. It's got one active, one active arm here, which is the dipole, and the rest of it is all just metal put in there to help shape a beam. In fact, I can comment on that. As I said before, the dipole and the monopole are the two basic elements. Everything else has to do in antenna design of putting metal around these two active elements to shape the beam in one way or another. This is just another way of doing it, okay? So I'm going to shift over here to the more common way of actually feeding an antenna is with a monopole antenna. It's just essentially half of the dipole. And the other half of the dipole, being a resonant element, is put in there by putting some sort of a ground plane around it. Now, the ground plane doesn't always have to be a flat piece of metal. It can also be like a car, which is very common. So the ground plane is tied into the metal shield of the coaxial cable. So this is a very common, it's mostly often called a whip antenna, which we see very often. Here we see 4 different whip antennas on a police car, okay? There are 4 monopole antennas, and they're using the police car as the ground side of the resonance. Below, we have a larger whip antenna, which would just be for a lower frequency in a cross-country type vehicle. Over here, we have 2 antennas, 2 whip antennas, one on each side of the car, and if you take any one of those antennas by itself, you would get a omnidirectional pattern from that antenna. But if you put a second antenna in there with the proper spacing, the 2 of them together will create a pattern that aims up and down behind the car and in front of the car on the road. So you gain quite a bit in the directionality of your pattern. The last type of antenna here is something everybody's had and played with. It's just a little radio with the whip antenna on it. You can change the length of the antenna to vary the frequency that you want to receive, and you can vary the angle of the antenna to get a better polarization. Now, you don't have to know what's going on, you just do it to get the best reception, right? But that's what you're doing, you're playing with polarization and you're playing with resonant frequency, okay? These are a couple, of course, lower frequency, so we get larger and larger and larger towers, and the towers can become part of the antenna itself. For those broadcast type towers, this is the kind of power that pattern that you would get from it. It's a nice omnidirectional pattern. It gives you full radiation around 360 degrees, typical radio or television type orientation. This is another type of monopole where you change the shape of the antenna portion on the upper part, put it into the shape of a disc, in the shape of a cone, and then the ground part below, you can change the radius of that and the position of that, in which you can get as a slightly varied pattern coming out of it as an omnidirectional pattern. Here's a couple examples of them for different frequencies. A very low frequency over here. This is a very large conical wire setup, and then an inverted one with the ground at the top and the cone portion lower down. This is a very common antenna used today. This is a patch antenna that's used on little GPS things and watches and things like that. The size of the antenna here is about a square inch or less, okay? And basically it's being fed up through a piece of dielectric, like a monopole, and then that's just a big flat piece of metal on the end of the dipole, on the end of the monopole. The dielectric here is of a higher value such that it makes the resonant frequency higher for a smaller space, okay? Now we're to something everybody's interested in, iPhone. These are patterns that I created in simulation, and I was never able to figure out any particularly unique pattern coming out of an iPhone. And I think that's pretty reasonable because there's so much different stuff going on in an iPhone, and it's a lot more important than the pattern. They always figure you can find a way to get the pattern to connect to the cell tower, but it's more important to have a camera in there and a battery in there and the electronics and all that other sort of stuff. So the bottom line here is when you're using a cell phone, if it's not got the best reception, move it, tilt it, rotate it, whatever. Sometimes even it may be behind you where the tower is over here. You could be in between the cell phone and the cell tower. Another type of antenna is a horn antenna. This has a monopole speed down in, like I said, that's the basic antenna right in there. The rest of this is all metal. It's been put around it to contain the radiation that's coming off the monopole and having it so it all comes out this effective aperture here and then radiate out to the side here. A simple way to understand how you get the gain of this, if we were to turn this vertically and have it in rain, the bigger the antenna, the more rain it would collect. Well, that's the same thing as an antenna. The gain is higher, more powerful, the bigger the antenna is. And that's just something I say down here. The bigger the opening is. But the horn antenna is very useful, and I'll show you work where we use that all the time. All right, let me just go back to that a minute. I wanted to also show how this is dependent upon frequency. So that's what these next curves are. So if we look at, these are curved from that same horn that I just showed, and we have 3 different frequencies here, 8, 10, and 12. And as you go up in frequency, the gain increases. So this is improvement here. And the other thing is the gain goes up, the beam width narrows down a little bit because you got to keep the same amount of power in the beam. Okay? And that's just a simple equation. The gain is proportional to the active area and the frequency squared. It's just, these are the kinds of things you really need to remember when you're dealing with antennas, so that when you're testing something in a simulation, if it's, the gain's not going up when it's supposed to be going down, you're doing something wrong. You don't figure out what it is.
So for the simulation, will you be changing the length of the monopole antenna within the horn with these different frequency?
If you wanted a little bit different frequency, you might tune that a little bit with the monopole in there. But that would be typically, you'd select waveguide for that frequency that you're really interested in. Make sure your frequency's within the band of the waveguide. Then you could tune it a little bit. All right, as you want to get more gain out of an antenna, which lots of people want to do, the way to do it is not make a horrendously big horn, but stay with a reasonably small horn, something about the size of my hands here, and put a dish behind it. So what you do is you radiate out this horn, a pattern into the dish. And the design here is to get the horn pattern just to feed the dish, Not be bigger than the dish, because then you waste a lot of energy spilling around the edge of the dish. If you make it too narrow and high gain, then you'll only hit the middle part of the dish and you won't be using the whole dish. So there is an optimum spread on the size of the feed horn relative to the size of the reflector. Now this is the most common one. It's got to be in the world. It's on practically every house, 18-inch dish. Now in this particular picture, I noticed that it looks like it has two feeds up here rather than just a single horn feed. And the dish itself is just acting as a reflector. There's nothing magic about it. As long as you're somewhere near the focal point, you can get a good reflection off of that dish. So you can put two horns there and have two completely independent systems working. In fact, I've seen this where there would be three horns close together like that. You've got three different channels to three different satellites up in the sky. Okay? Now, your house isn't going to move, hopefully, and the satellite's not moving. These are geostationary. So once you put this in place, you don't have to move it. Now, the next system, here's a 50-foot dish. To be able to look wherever you want to look, you've got to be able to rotate it 360 degrees around, and you also need to tilt it back and forth like that. That becomes very expensive. And then even more so when you get something like this, 100 feet space dish. Now on here, it's easy to see the rotating circular track at the bottom that this whole system can move around. And there's also a circular arc in here where the thing can rotate back and forth to plus or minus, I don't know how much, but maybe up to 90 degrees, so you can see anywhere in half space. Now, if this isn't big enough, and you don't want to keep making dishes bigger because you want to move them around, you go ahead and add a bunch of dishes together. This is the very large array in New Mexico, where all of these dishes are aimed exactly at the space at the same point, and the energy that comes into all of these is put all together, accumulated, and that's the power that they're getting out of that. Okay? Now, if that's not big enough, then you can go to the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico. That unfortunately doesn't work anymore because it did work for 50 years, and they got a lot of really good data from it. But one of these cables broke, and this thing comes crashing down into the dish, destroyed the feeds and also the dish. But you can see at the time, they could move this feed back and forth on this element, and then it had a circular thing right in here where you could rotate it around. So there was actually a cone in space that you could reflect off of that dish in. So they had quite a bit of capability to look around. You can see the gain here with a 1,000-foot dish is 400,000 times what you would have from a single antenna. Said I'd get back to this slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the repeater tower. I hadn't said anything about that. I did talk about how the antennas are reciprocal, can be used both as a receiver and a transmitter, and that's what you would put on a tower like this. Somewhere you want to go around buildings or over mountains, or any way that you can't shoot line of sight. You have to go from here to here and then over, and go around like that. You put these repeater towers, and the only thing you do is you put an amplifier between the receive antenna and the transmit antenna, so it boosts the signal up a little bit. Okay. One other thing is the microwave oven here. Basically, that's got a big power source, a magnetron in there that has a monopole antenna into a waveguide and dumps all this power into a big cavity. And that's what I'm going to look at here. You can see that from the colors there indicating the radiation intensity, the red being the really generate a lot of heat, and the blue no heat at all. That's what you get in a microwave oven. So to get some sort of even cooking, you have to use something like a platter. And of course that rotates around and averages the temperature of the food as it moves. Now I put an arrow there showing the middle of the platter because the middle of the platter doesn't move. You don't want to put your food in the middle of the platter. You know, most people do. They put their cup of coffee in the middle of the platter. That's the worst place to put it. You want to put it somewhere out towards the edge, and you get a much more even heating from it. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about arrays. You see what the benefits are. They're pretty obvious. What you can't do with a single antenna, you can do with multiple antennas. All the way down to the cost. The cost is now in feeding all the different elements. Anytime you're doing an array, you obviously have multiple elements. And you have to feed each one of these elements independently, both in magnitude and phase, depending on what you're trying to do with it. This is what most antenna people are doing today is working with arrays. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about using this 6-element array as an example. These are all being fed equally, both in magnitude and phase. So the result is going to be a broadside beam that's going to come out perpendicular to the surface of the array. Okay, so you don't have to know anything about antennas. It's just, say we got 6 antennas there,